being devalued, metaphysicians are still seeking true reality. They're still looking for some truth, and the thing in itself, compared to which everything else is merely apparent. Okay, that should make sense. Right? So that's the first point. Second point. Metaphysicians make these conceptual moves because it is an attempt to deal, right? They make this conceptual move because it is an attempt to deal with the problem of evil. Schopenhauer conceptualizes what's known as evil blind will, and Kant talks about in intelligible freedom, and I want to read this on note 17. It's at the very end, like the last sentence on the bottom of page 15 in the Kaufman text, bottom of note 17, close to the bottom of note 17. Schopenhauer wanted it otherwise, and therefore had to conceive of this metaphysical ground as the opposite of the ideal, right? Well, what is this thing? What is this opposite of the ideal? As evil, blind will. That way, it could be that which appears. I'll make sense of this because it's not necessarily clear. That which appears. That which reveals itself in the world of appearances. But even so, he did not renounce the absoluteness of the absoluteness of the ideal. He seeked it. What in the world does that mean, right? You know, I've read this book now. This will be my fourth time reading it, and I'm going obviously way more detail in my read in this, so I get more each time out of the text each time I read it. I'm trying to think the easiest way to explain it. Think of it like this. We have a notion of God, right? And part of that notion of God, we obviously know it's infinite, we know it's absolute, and etc., etc., etc. Part of that notion is also all good, all loving, all powerful, blah, blah, blah. And I've done videos on this, talked about the technical terms and whatever. Okay, here is our reality. We aspire for that. We recognize that the highest value with these characteristics collapses under itself because I don't have cognitive ability to rationally access the absolute truths. And I've given countless examples throughout the lecture, right? So the highest value, according to that principle, collapses, is devalued, right? The highest value becomes devalued. Okay, so we recognize that this is problematic. So then we say, okay, you know what? We don't want this system anymore. We want a new system, right? So we put something else in place for this new system. The question becomes, what is it that we can do? What could there be? Well, what Nietzsche is saying in this point is the following. We still want to preserve the notion of an absolute goodness, an absolute all-loving, coddling, nurturing, if you will, conception of some universal, absolute reality. And in antithesis to this, right, as sort of one polemic, right, here's a pole, right, as the opposite to this polemic is the absolute evil, right, is what's bad in the world, right, evil, right. So, just to read this so that we have an understanding, because this is important that you recognize this, right? Again, back at the end of 17, and I hope I'm not going through this too quick, but at the bottom of 17, he says, Schopenhauer wanted it otherwise, and therefore had to conceive of this metaphysical ground as the opposite of the ideal, as evil, blind will, right? I'm not going to write blind will because my hands are full. As evil, blind will. That way, it could be that which appears. Now, we'll stop right there. So that this evil, this blind will, this metaphysical opposition to the ideal, right? This metaphysical opposition to the ideal, evil, blind will, right, becomes that which is apparent. Right? This becomes apparent. Right? So in the example that we were giving before, the reality, right, the noumenal, the thing in itself, the infinite, that which exists as a transcendent concept, as a transcendent reality, is all good, all loving, all coddling, if you will. And I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to be facetious, but this is the idea. What we have, however, as phenomenal reality, if you buy into this system, Nietzsche is saying, if you buy into this system, then what we have as the only thing that we can access in this world, because all that is that of phenomenal appearance, right? Our connectedness to stuff, despite the fact that, if you're going to ascribe that there is some truth behind this other than what I'm able to immediately perceive as being all loving, all good, all infinite, all I see is the bad. All I see is the appearance, and the appearance is evil, right? This becomes a very, very seminal concept, right? This becomes a very, very seminal concept which we will develop as the discourse sort of unfolds, right? The idea that metaphysical evil, right? And I'll talk about this later. There's different types of natural evil, blah, blah, blah. But metaphysical evil exists as the polemic metaphysical concepts to this ideal that's posited, right? This ideal that's posited has an antithesis, and that antithesis is not transcendental. That antithesis is not otherworldly. That antithesis is phenomenal. It is apparent. It is real in the physical, physiological sense, and that antithesis is evil, right? So, very, 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 very important point. What ends up happening then in bullet point number 3, under failure to renounce the highest values, there is a renouncement of the Christian God, but not Christian morality. And this is sort of what I'm saying, right? There's a renouncement of the Christian God for the nihilist. The nihilist comes in and wants to renounce the Christian God, right? Say, well, let's get away with this notion of the Christian God. And we want to substitute the concept of this Christian God with something else, right? With a moral imperative. You pick your favorite one. He talks about Kant, right? So we want to fill it with sort of a deontological ethic. We want to fill it with a virtue ethic. We want to, in a more contemporary sense, fill it with a utilitarian ethic or whatever, right? We want to fill it with some new moral imperative. The problem is that this moral imperative, as imperative, is still going to have judgments, right? There's still going to be judgments. Right? There's still going to be judgments, right? The moral imperative says that you ought to do X, you don't do X, and I'm telling you, thou shalt do X, thou will do X, you must do X. You have to conform, right? So that the moral imperative enforces conformity. So granted, we've done away with Christian morality, but we still have substituted, right? We've pulled down this notion of God, and in place of pulling down this notion of God, we've substituted it with our favorite moral imperative, and it functions exactly the same as an established dogma, right? It functions exactly the same as established dogma. It's just not the Christian conception of God. And what Nietzsche is saying is like, you guys are caught in, I'm not sure if he talks about Buddhism now. I might get into that in a little bit. Nietzsche says, you're caught in a spiral, right? There is a sense in which we have not yet progressed outside of the system. And this is important, right? The system of, if you want to, justified moral judgment, right? Judgment is justified in this system insofar, and I'll say this a couple of times because it's important, right? Judgment is justified in this system insofar as there is a moral imperative which prescribes action, right? So judgment is justified in this system insofar as there is a moral imperative that prescribes action. If that moral imperative is utilitarianism, if it's Kantian deontology, if it's Aristotelian virtue ethics, or if it's Christian morality, it all prescribes action. Insofar as it prescribes action, there are consequences for not conforming to that action. It's exactly the same, right? So Nietzsche is saying, listen, you have substituted the idea of the Christian God, but you're still sort of encased in the notion and still abiding in and putting a lot of value into the faith of morality as defined by such, right? We'll see eventually how this unfolds. This goes through a series of transformations as the discourse continues, but I don't want to jump ahead. I think that's clear. Okay, last bullet point on page 8 of the notes. Quote, this is from note 20, from note